Shalom, shalom, shalom. Shalom, people. And happy Sabbath, because I'm recording this right now on the Sabbath. So, happy Sabbath. As you see from the title of the lesson, this lesson is going to be Bantu Israelites in South Africa. This is a history lesson. It's not a Bible lesson. It's a history lesson. But, like we always do, we should open up with a word of prayer and give praises to the Most High. So, dear Heavenly Father, we come before you right now asking you that this history lesson go over well and that the knowledge is spread and that it'll be beneficial to people and that it'll give them more information that they can use and just grow them intellectually. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right, so God asked a question about are all Bantus in South Africa Israelites? Well, excuse me, we're going to cover that in this lesson. With historical information and go over the sources. But the short answer to that question is yes. So we've done a lot of history lessons on different groups in Africa, and if the Lord allows me to keep living, I'm only in my mid-30s. If He allows me to keep living till a ripe old age, maybe we'll get to the point where we've done history lessons on the majority of groups in sub-Saharan Africa, covering their origins and just the history on it. And we like to do these lessons not even just on Semitic groups and Israelites that are in sub-Saharan Africa, but we even do lessons on the Hamitic groups as well. Because it's just good to spread knowledge about African history, because there's not a lot of you don't get a lot of that in the Western world. People being taught about African history, especially those of us in the diaspora. And it's good for us to learn that history. And even for those of us who are Israelites, you can't understand our Israelite history without understanding African history. It goes hand in hand. And before we jump into this lesson, I normally don't do this, but my wife and other people in the church have been saying, like, hey, got to grow this. So we do. If you like our lessons and you want to donate, you can donate on our YouTube page. You can donate on the church website, and there's a link in the description. All right, shalom. All right, so let's dive on in. And if my voice sounds groggy, it's because I'm recording this at like 6 something in the morning. All right, 2 Bantu groups dispersed from the Great Zimbabwe / Gokomere area into what is today South Africa. Okay. And the Great Zimbabwe, as the name would indicate, is in the modern day country of Zimbabwe. This migration began to take place around circa 400 AD. And we're not going to go in depth in dealing with Great Zimbabwe, but for the sake, if you don't know what that is and you're an African of the diaspora, after this lesson, go look up Great Zimbabwe and learn about that too. You need to learn about our ancient cultures and just our history and the things we built as a people. So anyways, Great Zimbabwe / Gokomere area into what is today South Africa. This and if I butcher any terms, Bantu people, forgive me. I'm not from Africa. I live in the United States, born and raised, so I don't know how to pronounce a lot of your words. So don't butcher me. Just receive the teaching that we're trying to spread knowledge about the Bantus over in South Africa. Don't focus on if I butcher a word. And if I do butcher a word, I apologize. All right, this migration began to take place around circa 400 AD. Prior to this, both groups had migrated down from northeast Africa via Arabia Felix. This initial migration from Arabia Felix, now I have in parentheses Sena, took place circa 150 AD. And Arabia Felix is the term that the Greco-Romans used to use for the southern Arabian Peninsula, or what you would call today modern day Yemen. Okay? And if you remember from a lot of lessons we've done on here, a lot of Israelite groups migrated over from Yemen into West Africa, Central, Southern Africa. The lesson we did on the Yoruba, we showed that they migrated from there because their origin stories line up with that. But anyways, all right. And there's other groups that migrated over from Yemen too that we've covered in other history lessons. All right. So where were we? This initial migration from Arabia Felix, Sena, took place circa 150 AD and was caused by political unrest in southern Arabia between the Himyarites, Saba, Qataban, Hadramaut, and Aksum. Okay, and Aksum, that was the kingdom in modern day Ethiopia. Sena was a thriving Jewish city at the time of the Medo-Persian Empire around 500 BC and is believed to have been dominated by Israelites who had fled Jerusalem during the Babylonian invasion. They crossed the Jordan into Yemen, believing they were safe in the valley in the east, crossing the Masilah River. And if you see that little number there in parentheses, that's a source. At the end of the lesson, I'll leave the source page up. As of late, we've been putting the sources in the slide, like right before we, talk about it. But in this lesson, I decided to go back to my original way I used to do lessons, and the sources will be at the end of the lesson. Okay. These two Bantu groups are known as the Nguni, and I'm not pronouncing the N because every time I pronounce the N, somebody tells me we don't pronounce the N, it's silent. So I don't know if the N is pronounced or not, but normally y'all tell me, Bantu people tell me it's not. So I'm just saying Nguni. And the Sotho-Tswana. In this lesson, we will show the Hebraic-Israelitish origins of both groups using historical and biblical evidence. All right, start off with the Nguni. The Nguni are one of the major divisions of the Bantu language group found in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Swaziland, and account for 60% of Bantu speakers in Southern Africa. And we'll get to this later in the lesson, but you'll find Nguni people outside of Southern Africa too because of Shaka Zulu and them migrating, them doing a reverse Bantu migration, some of the different Nguni clans and going up into Central and Eastern Africa. Okay, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the lesson. Today, there are an estimated 24 million speakers of Nguni languages, with the single largest group being Zulu, numbering at an estimated 11 million, living mainly in South Africa. The second largest group is that of the Xhosa, all right, and like I said, if I'm butchering that, sorry, Xhosa speakers, who number over 7.5 million and also live in South Africa. Northern Nguni is dominated by the Zulu, and Southern Nguni is dominated by the Hausa or Hosa. Hosa has borrowed 15 click sounds from Khoisan languages, more than any other Bantu language, which indicates long contact between the Khoisan and Hosa. And if you don't know who the Khoisan are those people, the original inhabitants of Southern Africa. And they used to be in Central Africa too, but they got pushed further and further south by the Bantu migrations. They're biblically they would be descendants of Ham, biblically descendants of the Canaanites. They're the ones who have the slanted eyes, just like East Asians do, but they're black. But they have the same features in the eyes as East Asians do. And we've covered before in other lessons that they would have descended from the Senites, which were a branch of the Canaanites, according to the Bible. Okay, but they were the ones originally living in the area before the Bantu group started coming down into the area. And as the Bantu groups came down into the area, they supplanted them. Okay, but also when the Dutch and the Europeans started coming into Southern Africa from the Khoisan, that's who they took a lot of their wives from. Okay, and when we get into the portion about slavery, a lot of they became the mixed offspring of the Europeans, and the Khoisan became slave traders, but we'll get into that later. All right, where are we at? The Nguni emerged from the Bantu peoples who arrived in South Africa sometime in the 4th century AD. They are closely related to the Sotho-Tswana, who moved out into the High Veld, while the Nguni moved south and reached Natal by the middle of the 11th century. The Nguni favored dense settlement patterns and developed the distinctive beehive style of architecture still associated with the Zulu. The Hosa were on the frontier of Nguni expansion and reached the eastern cape along the Fish River long before their first contact with Europeans in the middle of the 18th century. The Hosa were eventually defeated by the British in a series of wars with the Europeans, 9 in total from 1779 to 1879. The Zulu emerged as a dominant group among the northern Nguni in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as a result of struggles between contesting chiefdoms over resources, grazing lands for their cattle, and access to Portuguese trade goods from trading posts located at Delagoa and St. Lucia Bays. Shaka, founder of the Zulu state, forged the Zulu into a formidable fighting force and set out to build an empire. Those he conquered, he absorbed into the Zulu, while others fled north into Sotho-Tswana territory, where they spread terror and destruction. Those under Shaka's once general Mzili Kazi became the Ndebele or Matabili of Zimbabwe, while those under Sabhuza the first and then his son and heir Mswati formed the Swazi. Others fled south, seeking protection of the Hosa, and were generally called the Mfingo, meaning refugees. They and others, such as the Thimbu, Mpondo, Bomvana, and Bahaka, have been culturally absorbed into the Hosa. The period between 1816 and 1828 is called the Mfikani in Nguni languages, meaning the great crushing. The southern Debili are the Transvaal Dibli are Nguni in origin, but not related to the Dibli of Zimbabwe. They too are split between a northern and a southern group as the result of a quarrel over the leadership in the 17th century. The Transvaal Dibli have lived among the Transvaal Sotho for so long that they have taken up many of their customs, including their language. There are today some 500,000 or half a million Transvaal Dibli Debele, if I'm mispronouncing it, I'm sorry. And they have developed their own distinct culture. Their leader, Yabele, died around the same time of the Boer War in the first decade of the 1900s, served a major role in asking his people to preserve their culture. In addition to those groups who live in South Africa and Zimbabwe, there are small scatterings of Ngoni, usually spelled with an O, throughout the lakes region as far north as Kenya. They trace their origins to Natal and the Dewandiwi, who were defeated by Shaka in 1819. They fled the state making process of Shaka, but as they moved north, their superior organization and the military reforms they had learned from Shaka that they brought with them turned their flight into invasion and conquest. Groups of Ngoni are found in Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, Tanzania, and Kenya, and they number several hundred thousand in each country. Most Nguni are Christians, the largest percentage of who belong to the Hosa subgroup. As a result of their defeat by the British in 1853, and when they say most are Christian, most of them belong to like African Zionist churches in South Africa, but we'll get to that. Most Nguni are Christians, the largest percentage of who belong to the Hosa subgroup. As a result of their defeat by the British in 1853 and the subsequent death of 80% of their cattle due to a lung sickness introduced by European cattle, many Hosa turned to the prophetess Nongqawusi. Similar to the ghost dance among Native Americans, her prophecy foretold of a resurgence of native power and the destruction of the whites. The Hosa were to kill all of their cattle and destroy their grain, which would free them from the devil whose servants were the whites. In a great climax in 1857, more than 400,000 head of cattle were killed, and in the subsequent starvation, 40,000 Hosa died. In the aftermath of the cattle killing, the majority of Hosa turned to Christianity. The current South African national anthem, Kosi Sikile Africa is a Hosa hymn written in 1897 by the Hosa convert Enoch Santanga. Christianity had a harder time gaining ground among the Zulu. Even today, many Zulu hold to both the traditional belief system along with Christianity or belong to the syncretic Zionist apostolic churches. Traditional belief centers on the Amatongo in Hosa and Amadilozi in Zulu are spirits of the ancestors. Professional priest diviners called Isangoma, Izangoma in plural, in Nguni languages are trained to understand the wishes of the ancestors. A priest diviner must first apprentice to a working master to be trained, which can take years of hard study. We're going to read in the Bible in just a second where the Israelites practiced this as well. And this is why one of the reasons why they were put into slavery and dispersed throughout the world. And in South Africa, the Bantus need to come back to their true original Hebraic culture and start keeping the commandments of the Torah and keeping the laws of God and following Yahweh, who is their original God, and so that they can get the curses off of them. Because apartheid came and the Europeans came, the Bible talks about how the Israelites will be provoked to jealousy by a foolish nation coming from far away that they had never seen, speaking languages that they had never heard. Why do you think the white man showed up on your doorstep and took over South Africa and then instituted apartheid? Okay, that was all part of God's punishment for things like this. Okay, but we're going to read it out of the Bible. We're going to read it out of the Bible because the ancient Israelites, like as Israelites, we've been doing that kind of ooga booga nonsense for thousands and thousands of years. Okay, all right. A priest diviner must first apprentice to a working master to be trained, which can take years of hard study, though some become priest diviners at the call of the spirits who train them in dreams. Along with being able to contact and understand the wishes of the ancestors, they also are trained in the identification of medicinal plants and how to make and prescribe medicines from them. Once an apprentice is fully trained, a ceremony is held to mark the event, and the person will take on the beating that their ancestors tell them to wear as the mark of a fully accomplished priest diviner. Some of these are highly decorative and are worn when the person contacts the spirits, but for everyday wear, their position as a priest diviner is usually marked with beaded bracelets, anklets, and or beaded hair. All right, so let's look at First Samuel 28 verses 1 through 9. And of course, I'm reading from the KJV. And it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare to fight with Israel. And if you remember from Genesis chapter 10, where you have the table of nations, the Philistines are listed under Ham, and the Philistines are listed as one of the sons of Mizraim. Mizraim is the father of the ancient Egyptians, so the Philistines came out of the Egyptian line. A lot of the Philistines migrated into the Sahelian region of West Africa. We've covered that with a lot of lessons. Even there's markers where it says Joab chased this is where Joab chased the Philistines in Morocco, as far that he chased them that far into northwest Africa, and then they started migrating into the Sahelian region. Okay, anyways, that's just some learning on your way to learning. And Achish said unto David, know thou assuredly that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men. And David said to Achish, surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do. And Achish said to David, therefore I will make thee keeper of mine head forever. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him, and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. So Saul was king of Israel at the time, and he had put out all of what we're talking about here with the Nguni people in South Africa, the priest diviners who can sort with the dead ancestors. That's what these are. Wizards, the priest diviners. And when it's talking about familiar spirits are the spirits of the ancestors. Okay? And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. And when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. because the Lord had abandoned Saul, because Saul had done some wicked things. Then said Saul unto his servants, seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. And Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up whom I shall name unto thee. All right. And then I'll read verse 9. She says, the woman said unto him, behold, thou knowest what Saul have done, how he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits, and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life to cause me to die? And if you know this story, we're not going to continue reading, but a demonic spirit comes up in the image of Samuel, looking like Samuel, and gives them a message. You know, and that's what you're dealing with these priest diviners. Excuse me, I have to blow my nose. With these priest diviners who be dealing with their ancestors. According to the Bible, your ancestors are dead. Okay? They're not coming back to life. They're not in heaven. Nothing's happening to them till the resurrection of the dead. When you have the first resurrection and the second resurrection, which you can read about in Revelations chapter 20, you can read about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and you can read about all throughout the Bible. So when these so-called ancestors are the spirits of your ancestors come up and deal with these priest diviners, they're really just communing with demons. Okay? Might not want to do that. Now, let's look at 1 Kings chapter 21, get another example. Just showing you that the same thing that the Nguni practiced, their traditional belief system, is the same thing Israelites were dibbling and dabbling in ancient times. Okay? Their ancestors have always been doing that. Mixing in true syncretic worship, mixing in true worship of Yahweh with the what I call Ooga Booga stuff that they learned from the Canaanites and the Egyptians and other Hamitic groups in biblical times. 1 Kings 21. And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And this is the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay. 2. And Ahab spake unto Naboth, saying, give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it. Or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. I'm looking at this, and I'm like, is this what I want? This might be the I don't think this is what I want. Hold on a second. Let's double check. Was it 2 Kings? I have a bad habit of doing that. Hold on. When I be putting these lessons together. Yeah, I think it's 2 Kings. All right, we want 2 Kings 21, I believe. Give me just a second. Yeah. All right. 2 Kings 21, starting at verse 1. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 50. And so if you're watching this lesson, it says 1 Kings 21, but we want 2 Kings 21. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 50 and 5 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hephzibah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, after the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. The heathen just means other nations, and the other nations that were cast out from before the children of Israel were all Hamites, Africans, they were Canaanites. Okay? Excuse me, for he built up again the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he reared up altars for Baal and made a grove, as did Ahab king of Israel, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them. And he built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord said, in Jerusalem will I put my name. And he built altars for all the hosts of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of the Lord. And he made his son pass through the fire, and observed times. Making his son pass through the fire means he sacrificed his son. All right, and if you study West African history, a lot of the West African groups used to practice human sacrifice still up until the 1800s. Okay, just ridiculous. All right, And he made his son pass through the fire, and observed times, and used enchantments, and dealt with familiar spirits and wizards. He wrought much wickedness in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. That's all we need to read. Just the point here is that he was dealing with familiar spirits, which is dealing with the ancestors. All right, moving on. All right, we're going to take a quick little sidebar and just deal with Shaka Zulu real quick. Shaka Zulu, founder of the Zulu Empire. Shaka was an exceptional leader who brought his relatively insignificant Zulu people to become the leaders of Natal's Nguni people. Shaka was born around 1787, and from the time of his birth until the present, his life has been surrounded by myth and tales of magic, which is known. What is known is that Shaka was the eldest son of Zulu prince Sinzenga Kahona and Nandi, daughter of Behebehi, former chief of the Elangini, an unimportant chieftaincy in Natal. Sinzenga Hona and his family refused to acknowledge the child was his when Nandi sent word that she was pregnant. They told Nandi's messenger to say that she must have the stomach beetle or a shaka rather than be pregnant. When her son was born, she called him Shaka in order to drive home the point that Sinzanga Hona was the father. Following customs, Sinzanga Hona had to recognize his son, and Nandi required no less than 50 head of cattle as lebola or bride price. Nandi had problems with others in Sinzanga Hona's household, and eventually Sinzanga Hona expelled the mother and child. Shaka entered the service of Dingi Swale of the Mtitwa chieftaincy, where he excelled as a warrior. Dingi Swale helped Shaka take the Zulu chieftaincy when Sinzanga Hona died. When Dingi Swale was killed in battle, Shaka took over the Mtitwa as well. Shaka furthered Dingi Swale's military reforms and introduced a new, larger shield and the short stabbing spear, which replaced the longer throwing spear. He also modified battle tactics and introduced the buffalo format. 2 horns to encircle an enemy that forced them onto the front lines, while the rear acted as reinforcements. Shaka's half-brothers, Dingiani and Mihi Angana, plotted to assassinate him. They were able to pull into their plot some of Shaka's closest advisors, importantly his chief aide Mbopa, which with secure inside help, Shaka was assassinated in 1828. All right, sorry for butchering some of those words, but like I said, I can't pronounce those words. I was born and raised in America. And he's like the first. I've never even heard these words pronounced. I've just read them, so I apologize. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, the Sotho-Tswana. The Sotho and closely related Tswana are Bantu peoples living in Lesotho, South Africa, and Botswana. They are divided into 3 main groups: Southern Sotho of Lesotho and the nearby regions in the Orange Free State, the Northern Sotho of Transvaal, and the Western Sotho of Tswana, who live mainly in Botswana, and the border region with South Africa. Together, they number over 10 million people. Most Sotho, Basotho plural, and Botswana plural, is the usual way of referring to the people. Sotho, and the Setswana are the adjectives used to refer to their languages. And Lesotho and Botswana are used to refer to their places where they live. The North Sotho dialect is called Sesotho e Leboa, while South Sotho is simply called Sesotho. A more Lesotho specific term is Sesho, pronounced Seshwe. See, like I would have never known to pronounce that because in my like American English mind that says say shoot, but say shwe, meaning the people of Moshosho the first, who ruled from 1804 to 1870. Moshosho is pronounced Mu Shwe Shwe, the founder of the modern state of Lesotho. The northern Sotho are composed of people of Sotho origin, such as the Pedi, while others have been absorbed into the Sotho, such as the Nguni Transvaal Deble. The Pede have lived around Fala Borwa since the 4th century AD. Other northern Sotho includes the Lobido, who are ruled by the Majadiji rain queens. The Debili are of Nguni origin and arrived in the Transvaal in the 16th century as a result of their long-time residence among the northern Sotho. The Dibli have adopted a number of Sotho practices, including the language. However, they have also preserved some aspects of their Nguni origins in aspects of their language, words associated with the homestead and lineage, and customs. Dibli women are famous for their beadwork, which is among the most elaborate in South Africa. The Sotho and Tswana received Christian missionaries from Protestant evangelical churches in the 1830s. Sotho and Tswana leaders quickly recognized the value these missionaries had in subsequent dealings with the Afrikaner Boers and later with the British. The Afrikaner Boers are just Dutch people that came to South Africa and committed horrible atrocities. In 1862, Catholic missionaries arrived in Lesotho, and today the majority of the Basotho in Lesotho are Catholics. Christians total approximately 80% of Basotho and 71% of Botswana. In addition, a local version of Christianity emerged in South Africa that combined aspects of indigenous religion with Christianity, called the Zionist Apostolic Church. The Zionist Apostolic Church has wide appeal throughout southern Africa, with adherents in Lesotho, South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. Nonetheless, there is still a minority of both Sotho, 20% in Lesotho, and Tswana, 6% in Botswana, who practice their traditional religion, which focuses on the relationship between the living and the ancestors, called Malimbo slash Balimo in Sesotho and the Midimo slash Bodimo in Setswana. The ancestors contact the living through dreams, for example, and traditional doctors are Lingaka, a Sesotho, pronounced, wow, Dinyaka Iya Sesutu. Whoa. Ling Aka is the plural of Gaka, meaning a healer or doctor. And when we just covered that when we were going over the Zulu and we read scriptures showing that's the same stuff the ancient Israelites were dibbling and dabbling in. A specialized class of traditional priest healers are able to interpret what the ancestors want. Traditional priest healers use a range of tools to contact and understand the wishes of the ancestors, including throwing the bones, and using drums. They provide medicines and cures for those who are ill, circumcise boys and make the medicines used after the circumcision operation, and provide charms against lightning, birds, and wild animals from destroying crops. Kind of similar to what the Levites did, right? Anyways, they also provide charms against the actions of a Tokolasi, an imp-like creature, and other familiars of witches. In addition to the Lingaka, traditional belief includes the Boloe, Moloe, in singular, are witches. Unlike the Gaka, who uses his knowledge for the good of the people, witches are capable of evil. Maloe uses covens to focus their power and are able to harm others simply by thinking it. In the past, Lingaka were used by the ruling elite to smell out Boloi, in special ceremonies. Today in Lesotho, certain villages have reputations for witches, such as Ha Taloni, located within a few miles of Morija mission station. All right, continuing on, and we're just giving background on both of these groups because we like to kick knowledge over here and cover the total ground of history, so we have to deal with the background because a lot of people in the Western world and in the diaspora don't even know who these two Bantu groups really are. So we're gonna, give you the background information at first. The Sotho-Tswana arrived in southern Africa with other Bantu speakers sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. The Bantu brought with them knowledge of ironworking, and the iron mines around Phalaborwa in the Transvaal have been used since the 3rd century and may be the original heartland for the Sotho-Tswana. So that was one of the ways the Bantus were able to gain advantages over the Hamitic groups that they encountered and other like the Pygmies, the Khoisan, the Cushitic groups, the Nihitic groups, when they came in with their knowledge of iron making from ancient times. And they learned that knowledge of iron making back when they were in ancient Israel. Okay? Now, the Sotho-Tswana moved out into the high veld and established large towns with stone-built homes. They engaged in intensive agriculture and raised large herds of cattle. All this means is that from thousands of years ago, the Sotho-Tswana had a civilized and highly developed culture. Cattle came to play an important part of social values, being held in high regard and a means of noting status. Modern history for both the Sotho and the Tswana begins with the Lifakane, or Great Crushing, caused by the expansion of the Zulu state under their great leader Shaka. In 1816, Shaka became the ruler of the Zulu, and by 1818 he had embarked on his policy of creating an empire. As the Zulus expanded, conquering and destroying those who opposed them, many of the peoples of Natal and nearby areas tried to flee, causing a ripple effect that reached as far north as the Lake District of Kenya and Tanzania. Modern Lesotho, man, Shaka was getting it in, huh? But that the Israelites have a rich culture and history of generals. The greatest general in the world of all time, Joshua, Israelite. Moses, this is not mentioned in the Bible, but according to tradition, historical traditions, Moses was a general in the Egyptian army and did exploits in Cush, in modern day country of Sudan and like northern Ethiopia and stuff, right? Who else? Joab was a great general, also mentioned in the Bible. Hannibal Barca, who was Punic, which was made him a Canaanite, but his name Barca comes from Barak, which is a Hebrew Israelite name. So Hannibal could have been an Israelite, could have been a Canaanite, could have been a mixture of Canaanite and Israelite, but still one of the greatest generals in history. And you throw Shaka into that mix as well. Okay. Anyways, as the Zulus expanded, conquering into modern Lesotho was born out of this time when the chief of the Bakuena, Moshweshwe, hopefully I got that right this time, was able to gather a number of Sotho under him. He relocated his capital to Thaba Basu, a large table-topped plateau, a comfortable distance from Shaka in Natal, and not far from the modern capital of Maseru. Moshweshwe was able to mollify Shaka by sending him gifts of cattle and young women and thus survived the period of expansion. Shaka was assassinated by his brothers in 1828 and Moshweshwe was able to solidify his control over the different Sotho lineages by placing close relatives over them as principal chiefs. All right, just gonna leave this picture up for a minute, let y'all look at it. You can read the caption underneath it. This is just for it's a long lesson, so if you need to take a break, go use the bathroom. This would be the time. All right, hope you used the bathroom, got you a snack or something, because we're about to dive on in. All right. In 1844, the British annexed Natal. The largely British settlers were acutely aware that to the north there was a powerful Zulu state, and as a result, considerable interest in Zulu customs and traditions was generated. Captain Francis Gardiner, 1794 to 1851, a commander in the Royal Navy and a devoted missionary, who was later to die of starvation along with missionary companions on a desert island in Tierra del Fuego, went on a journey traveling east from the Cape to Natal. Upon his first encounter with the Zulus, he took their customs to be apparently of Jewish origin, and the Zulus themselves to be of Jewish extraction. All right, now how clear is that for you? Here's your answer to your question. Are the Bantus in South Africa Israelites? Answer yes. All right, but anyways, let's keep reading. The Zulu customs that led him to this conclusion included circumcision, Levite marriage, the festival of the first fruits, and a number of others. In 1835, Gardiner was sent to negotiate a peace with the Zulu chief Nguni at his winter home, Kwakehengla, near present-day Eshowe. Upon his return after, maybe that's Eshwe, I don't know. Anyways, upon his return after lengthy and detailed talks about every aspect of Zulu life, Gardiner reported that Zulu religious beliefs were quite simply a remnant of pre-Christian Judaism. As British power was extended further east, the same discourse continued. Throughout the 1850s, Zulus continued to be racially constructed as Jews. Their settled pastoral life and their religious and social customs were evidence enough of this. G.R. Peppercorn, the magistrate of Pafana location, observed to the Native Affairs Commission that a general type of the customs and laws of the Zulu may be found in the early history of the Hebrews. Zulu polygamy, marriage customs, even attitudes toward work were all described in the appropriate biblical passage. He suggested that any European who wanted to understand Zulu customs had only to read the Old Testament. Henry Francis Finn, 1803 to 1861, an English traveler, trader, and an acknowledged expert on Zulu customs, left behind a diary that is one of the best sources on the history of the Zulus. The diary covers the period from 1824 to 1836, when Finn was living much of his time with the Zulus. I was surprised, he wrote, to find a considerable resemblance between many of the Zulu customs and those of the Jews. These included war offerings, sin offerings, proprietary offerings, festival of first fruits, periods of uncleanness, on the disease of relatives and touching the dead, circumcision, rules regarding chastity, rejection of swine's flesh. Finn can stop eating pork or get scorched on the torch. The Israelite man needs to stop eating that nasty, abominable pig and keep the dietary law. Don't get tossed into the lake of fire off of some bacon, all right? Finn concluded in the usual way of the Hamitic hypothesis that in view of the nature of semblance of many of their customs to those of the ancient Jews, as prescribed under the Levitical priesthood, I am led to form the opinion that the Zulu tribes have been very superior to what they are at the present time. A similar analysis was made by John Colenso, 1814 to 1883, the famous Cambridge-educated biblical scholar, mathematician, and Christian socialist who was ordained Bishop of Natal in 1853. He arrived in Natal the following year and quickly became fluent in Zulu. He went on to publish a grammar and dictionary of the language. Colenso was convinced that the two Zulu names for God embraced perfectly the notions of the divine contained in the Hebrew words Elohim and Yahweh. So close indeed were the resemblances, according to Colenso, that frequently he suggested that anyone who wanted to really understand the Bible had best study Zulu customs. Zulu habits and even the nature of their country so nearly correspond to those of the ancient Israelites that the very scenes are brought continually, as it were, before their eyes and vividly realized in a practical point of view. Practically everything about the Zulus, from their lunar calendar to the order of religious feasts, seemed to reflect an Israelite past. The Zulu keeps his annual feast and observes the new moons as the old Hebrew did. When the 12 tribes of the ancient kingdom of Judah were exiled for 70 years by the Babylonians, it became difficult for some of them to uphold their Jewish customs as they were living in a foreign land and under captivity. As a result, some of them gave up hope that they would return to the Holy Land of Israel and started to deviate from Judaism. They broke several Jewish canonical laws by getting married to people of non-Jewish culture, a development which, according to Scripture, did not please God. Nonetheless, the Jewish captives continued with their ways, and when they finally returned to Israel after the fall of the Babylonian Empire, many did not think their deeds in exile would be punished. However, upon reaching the Holy Land, the people who had married people of other nations were told to give up their foreign families or risk being expelled from the kingdom of Judah. Many, and you can read about this in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah, many disobeyed this order and were expelled from Israel as they were deemed to be tainted before God. Those who were expelled then moved out of Israel and settled in Yemen, where they lived for several years in a city called Sena. From there, the group split into various groups and migrated to different parts of the world, including Africa. All right, this is from a source I've used before. We just want to read one point, but in this source that I brought out, this guy just flat out tells you like the bulk of the Bantu groups throughout all of Africa are pretty much Israelites. But this lesson we're dealing with the Zulu, we're dealing with the Nguni, which the Zulus fall under, and we're dealing with the Tswana Sotho. So the Bantu peoples had so far degenerated when found by modern Europeans that they had no written speech, and but very little is to be found in the way of picture writing. Yet the Zulu Kafir language, to which we may refer as a representative Bantu tongue, is in both form and content just such a type of speech as we would expect to be developed from the ancient Hebrew. All right. Selamolela 2009 and Mfelo 2009 recall the journey of the Limba. And why we're bringing up the journey of the Limba is because the Nguni people and the Tswana Lesotho and the Tswana Sotho people all had the same similar long migration pattern as the Limba. And the Limba are a Bantu group that live in Zimbabwe that are related, and some of them live in South Africa too, and they're related to um, these groups, and like the Shona in Zimbabwe, they're all related. All right. So, and plus they live in South Africa as well, not just Zimbabwe. So let's read about their migration. Recall the journey of the Limba as found in many praise songs and recitations. From the original Sena in the north, remember that's in Yemen, right? The chronology, I always mispronounce that word. Anyways, I'm sorry. And dating is not clear. The chronology, there we go. The chronology and dating is not clear at all, but that is how they remember it. It has been recited in numerous ways and transferred from generation to generation. Sena 1, they can't recall where it was. Sena 2, Sena 1 was rebuilt somewhere in Tanzania, Kenya, or Uganda. Sena 3, they again rebuilt the city of Sena, this time on the Zambezi in modern-day Mozambique, Mashinhindiziri in Mozambique, Chiramba in the Weza district, Zimbabwe, Gokomere east of Harare, and Gokomere is where you had a highly developed civilization start to grow before the Great Zimbabwe was built. Okay. Shavahani Shabani in southern Zimbabwe, Belalingwa in southern Zimbabwe, Buhawa south of Mbalingwa, Mapungu Biwi on the Limpopo, South Africa, Dezata in the South Pansberg area in Gili Valley, Matasengope, Guyana, modern-day Limpopo, Luvihimbi in the former Vinda, close to Mokandi, Tashive, close to Donald Fraser Hospital, former Vinda, Chakuma in Lava and Lave Hubu, Leudi east of Louis Tricard, Elim, south of Louis Tricard, Fusule, Fusele, modern-day Linyenyi, close to Zanin, Sake Gopo, Mo Ketisi, Mamale, close to Sokemer, and they have a reference there, Conaway 1738, 1978, 38. All right, let's keep moving on. All right, so now we're going to deal with slavery. And it boggles my mind, man. As a people, we have such a rich history. And so it just boggles my mind how savage we act sometimes. I don't know if we act savage in South Africa. I see a lot of stuff that I watch going on in South Africa, and it seems like we act savage over there too. But even here in America, we just savage. No knowledge of self, no knowledge of our history. And so we do retarded things as a people. Just boggles my mind. All right, because if you don't know knowing your history and your culture is a good way to keep you civilized and to have you do civilized things instead of doing retarded stuff like we do. Anyways, all right, I just wanted to put that out there. We need to learn our history. Now, the reason why we're covering slavery is because one of the things that is a sign of the Israelites when the curses were put upon them was going into captivity and being dispersed throughout the nations, right? To the four corners of the earth. Now, the resulting period of state formation often involved initial stages of conquest by force, was prompted into 2 decades of violence because of the activities of Europeans encroaching from both east and west. In the east, slave traders found a new supply of ready victims in the area around Delagoa Bay and fostered continued violence to meet their demands for slaves. Similarly, across the northern border of the Cape Colony, white frontiersmen supplied renegade Griqua or Korana with guns and ammunition. The Griqua Korana were the mixed descendants of the Europeans and the Khoisan people. All right, and they became slave traders. And remember, the Khoisans are Hamites. All right, excuse me. With guns and ammunition they needed to raid neighboring Africans for cattle and slaves, which they traded back to the farmers. With the massive migration of Dutch Boers into the interior to escape British rule in the 1830s and 1840s, white intrusion became overt and direct, and any African hope of political stability and peace was lost forever. The Dutch settlers were therefore forced to look elsewhere for their labor needs. In 1658, a year after the first freeburgers had been granted their plots of land, the first slaves were imported into South Africa, specifically for agricultural work. These slaves arrived at the Cape on the 28th of March 1658 on board the Amersfoort and had been captured by the Dutch from a Portuguese slaver en route to Brazil. So these were slaves that were going to be brought to Brazil, probably being taken from Mozambique or Southeast Africa, and they got captured and they were brought to South Africa. So you have some Bantus in South Africa who are not even originally from South Africa. Their ancestry might go back to the Congo, Ghana, like West Africa, which don't. In West Africa, they're not Bantu. It's the language family is called the Niger Congo. And the Congo branch is where you get the Bantus. The Niger branch is your West Africans. So they were brought from there. Some of them were brought from there and brought down into South Africa. So they would be, they're Israelites too, right? We've covered that. Brought into Southern Africa as slaves, all right? Our captivity, it has so many layers, it's ridiculous. You would think over time we would learn knowledge of self and learn history and begin to keep the commandments so we can get God off of our back from punishing us, all right? But we never learn as a people. Of the 250 slaves captured, only 170 survived the journey to the Cape. Most of these slaves were originally captured by the Portuguese in present-day Angola. Not Mozambique, they were captured from Angola. All right. I'm from America. On May 6, 1658, I don't do that backwards dating. On May 6, 1658, 228 slaves from another group of slaves arrived at the Cape on board the Hassalt from Ghana. From 1710 onwards, the adult slave population outnumbered the adult colonial population by as much as 3 to 1. All right, now we're going to read this article from a South African newspaper about Enoch Mgijima. No, no, no. You don't get it, my brother. Says the sharply dressed Lawazi Mgulwa, the church elder assigned to chaperone me to Intabalenga, or New Jerusalem, as it is known by Prophet Enoch Gijimi's devotees, the Israelites. We are talking about the mystical and otherworldly nature in which the Church of God and Saints of Christ interprets its main text, the Old Testament, with a sense of African and Hebrew mythology. We are not a democracy. We don't practice democracy here, but theocracy, he says. Talk veers in and out of old Jerusalem, Judaism, the African liberation struggle, and fact and fiction. Although at times it feels like I am in an anthropology class, it also sounds like I'm listening to people talking in tongues. In short, music to my ears. African spirituals, African spirituals. Recently, we were at an all-day service at Tabernacle Number 5, the Israelites' National Center of Worship in Lungisi Township in Komani, Queenstown, where I was able to appreciate a combination of music, spectacle, the performance art of testifying, as well as the colors used in the church as signifiers central to its mythology. Elders Gulwa and Akslani Giwi, the pastor in charge of Tabernacle Number 5, and I are now en route to the church's holy land in Tabalanga, also known as Bullhoek, where the church's narrative and mythology not only begins, but to this day seems to be locked, their Zion to wit. At 42 degrees Celsius, and I don't know what that is because I live in America and we use Fahrenheit, so I have no idea what that is. Queenstown is a furnace as I guess it means it's hot, as we navigate one pothole after another. This Pesach, I'm going to say what that actually is, Passover. This Passover marks exactly 100 years since the church was founded in the village of Tebelanga, and 92 years after hundreds of its congregants were mown down on the mountain slopes above the village, in what came to be known as the Bullhoek Massacre. The church was founded by the charismatic preacher on December 22nd, 1912, a few months before the Union of South Africa instituted the notorious Land Act of 1913. The very genesis of the faith anticipated blood and racial warfare from the get-go. Birth of a prophet. One of 5 boys in a brood of 9 born to Meikisu Gijimi and Makeswa, Enoch Jonas Gijimi, came into the world in 1868 in the picturesque village of Intebelanga, just outside Whittlesea, known to Hosa locals as Wettelisi, shortly before the gold rush. Whereas his siblings schooled at prestigious institutions such as Lovedale College and Alice, Gijimi shunned formal education because of a massive recurring headache, later believed to be a sign of a diviner's gift, and chose to be a hunter instead. To this day, legend has it that he was one of the most talented hunters of his time and was usually seen riding one of his horses atop the mountains, hugging the village. At the heart of the Israelites' myth and narrative is the belief held by both his original followers as well as the current congregants that Gijimi, then 39 and just another member of the Wesleyan Church, had a life-altering visitation from the Almighty in 1907 in the form of a human figure. He was ambling about in his homestead just before dusk, Gulwa says, when a mystical figure tapped him on the shoulder and commanded him, "Follow me." The visitation was followed by a dream in which he grew huge feathers, flew into the sky, and finally came across a swarm of locusts the size and ferocity of which he had never seen, and was explicitly told that there would be not one, not two, but 3 world wars in his lifetime. Although it might have sounded just like speculative hokum, the world was indeed embroiled in 2 destructive wars that we have not recovered from, and is still gripped in an omnipresent Middle East crisis. To his believers, Mgijima was not only a man of his word, but of his dreams too. Halfway to New Jerusalem, I am swamped by the incredulity of it all. Direct orders from God, men growing wings, swarms of locusts, premonitions of world wars. Lord of heavens, this is too much. And yet, though I am traversing the holy space between logic, realism, fantasy, and mystique, as though I am a character in the most phantasmagoric of David Lynch films, I am surprisingly still on my feet. During the brief time I attended service at Tabernacle number 5, I went through what can be called the Israelites experience, through which it is easy to see how one can have your head in the clouds and your feet firmly planted on earth. Their morning to very late afternoon Sabbath services are the best example of a life lived in the here and now, as well with hearts and eyes cast towards the afterlife. The weekend I went to church, the usually colorfully dressed congregants, pink, red, yellow, brown, white, and purple are some of their symbolic colors, were dressed in rather solemn tones. It is because one of us had passed away, so we are mourning. The elderly carried off the mourning in black garb, below the knee dresses for women, and long Dickens era concierge black jackets and pants for men. The girls wore white shirts and black skirts, and the boys wore white jackets and shirts and gray slacks. The Israelites don't sing. They rapture and ululate. Their worship is composed of real-life testimonials amid breakbeats of musical rituals featuring flightly saxophone solos and evocative trumpets. It is a visual spectacle reminiscent of the Venda snake dance, the Damba. Suffused with holy voices and more testimonials, you start wondering which world you are actually in right here, right now. I couldn't tell. Are there beliefs and mythology on the surface, a body of absurd theories and fragmentary references to biblical history, some kind of spiritual junkyard where anything seems to go, to be taken at face value? I don't know. Growing up the grandson of a preacher man and a descendant of African healers myself, part of me is reluctant to dismiss other people's narratives as fantastical, just because they don't chime with my Marxist dialectical BS. So I nod the head and shut the F up. I don't know, dude. I'm reading this guy's article, but I can tell you I don't like his journalistic style. He seems kind of douchey. But we're not here for, him. We're here just to get information about this group. All right. And his style reminds me, here in America, we have an African American news outlet called The Root, and the journalists on there write similarly, and I can't stand the way they write. And of course, The Root's not owned by Israelites, it's owned by Latinos. Just more learning on your way to learning. Bible says the stranger will rise up above you. But anyways, the story of Mfaswi. Surrounded by blue-gray mountains, misty hills, and hillocks, Teblenge village is a captivating place in that National Geographic visual sense. Although it is desolate, pastoral, and has a haunted air about it, it also gives off an air of defiance easy to miss in a wink. The sort of place that seems never to shed a tear for itself. We head to the memorial site where the members of the church were slain in mass. Gulwa leads me to an enclosed area at the foot of the mountain. 2 major tombstones are placed above a screed of names, writ like a hero's roll call on a concrete slab as you enter the site. A full tutorial commences. Although he had his first visitation in 1907, Mgijima officially established the church in 1912. Gulwa and Gwigwi take turns to explain. The prophet started building on the visitation only after a man going by the name of John Isaac Misikinia, fresh from theology and anthropology studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C., came looking for him. I've heard the same narrative from the oldest member of the congregation. 90-year-old Bishop Joshua Mbeyi of Shiloh. Mr. Kenya was just a messenger, and this is the news he came bearing for Ngijima. Enoch, secede and do your thing. The instruction came from Pastor William Saunders Crotty in the United States. Crotty was a runaway slave, a soldier, and the founder of the original Church of God and Saints of Christ, the world's oldest black Hebrew denomination. It was Crotty's belief that descendants of African slaves, as well as Africans in the mother continent, were the lost tribes of the biblical Israel. And so on December 22nd, 1912, a few months before the introduction of the Natives Land Act of 1913, apportioning 80% of the country's land to the 5% settler population, Ngijima's Israelites were born. The story of the Israelites in this country is also the tale about the war, the 1921 massacre that they now remember as Mfaswe, calamity. The story is that soon after he accepted his calling, Ngijima took to spreading the word like a duck to a pond. As I remember, my parents and other elders spake about his gifts. The man was a gifted, charismatic rapspeter, says Beyi, who was born into the church 2 years after the massacre and 3 years before Ngijima's death. He was also a rhetorician, says Mbeyi, metaphorically, who could rouse the animals from their sleep and speed up the flow of rivers with his serene and soaring voice. So magical is the Israelites' narrative that simple things such as facts, numbers, and dreams justify our often rigid logic. When they speak, they create some kind of magical sensibility no dialect can easily break down. Although I am right there in Tebalanga, I also feel like I'm floating like Colonel Aureliano Buendía in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Macondo village in the 100 Years of Solitude. Could it be, this journalist dude is whack. Could it be that these people have a key to some kind of incendiary anti-logic we need to make sense of this senseless world? I wondered hard about the curious case of Enoch Ngijima. Yes, he was talented, but how did he become a mythical figure? Our parents told us that the prophet started traveling the country, preaching and restoring African folks' faith in themselves. He was like a missionary, says Beyi. Some say that everywhere Ngijima went, he preached and embellished doomsday theology, cobbled as much from the Old Testament as from his own rich imagination. Thus it came to pass that after several years of preaching a certain kind of apocalyptic message, his followers not only listened but actually heard. Only the truly devout, the children of Israel, will be called to the kingdom of God. Cryptic liturgy for eternal joy in the afterlife. There is also a recurring theme in my conversation with Beyi. Despite a naughty wink in his sense of humor, he's empathetic as he keeps on reminding me, look, some of these things might not make sense to you, but this is your life. It's not ours. Where's yours, Bishop? We don't believe in the world you live in, he tells me. As for Ngijima and the doomsday theory, Gulwa and Giwi refute the idea of the apocalypse. We don't believe that the prophet preached about the end of the world. We also don't believe he told people to come to Tebalanga to meet the Savior. People might have decided to be with him the Passover of that year. But why? Every Passover they congregated there. Apocalypse now or never. On May 5th, 1921, the children of Israel from every nook and cranny of southern Africa heeded Ngijima's voice and illegally squatted around the church and the prophet's premises in Tebalanga in anticipation of the end of days. But to this day, the prophet's followers maintain he said nothing about the apocalypse. People came to pray to be with their prophet. What's wrong with that? Beyi asked me, in May 1921, the weeks flew by and there was still no sight of the Savior. Waiting for God became the ultimate test, not only of their faith, but of their earthly character as well. Soon they ran out of food, water, and whatever other items of substance they had brought with them. Things fell apart. A battle is brewing. At this point, according to records in the South African History Archive, The Union sent one of its police commanders, General Theo Truder, to the area. He promptly dispatched a letter instructing Mgijima to urge his followers to disperse. Mgijima flipped and sent this reply: Dear Commander, you take your orders from the government, I take mine from Jehovah. The government believed the Israelites had invaded the land illegally. Mgijima believed that the Hubi chiefs had granted him permission to temporarily accommodate his congregants on their land. The government would have none of that. The stage was set for a massive confrontation. Today, if you talk to villagers for long enough and with patience, they will sketch a picture of the neurotic nature of the Union's authorities. They will tell you that General Jan Smuts planted snitches all over the place. In Tebalenga, a farmer known as Mudachek was one of them, led by Colonel Johan Davy and General Koos van der Winter, so a Dutch. The troops promptly arrived, Van der Duzen. The troop promptly arrived and stationed themselves at two strategic points in Tabalanga Mountains. I can't pronounce that. All right, the Bullhuck Valley, and I can't pronounce that. Stevens Valley. Its infrastructure. It is instructive that the troops settled on the exact spots on the mountains that Hosa folk refer to as, can't pronounce that. Both the loose and literal translations of the Hosa word meaning crossroads and sometimes unyielding obstacle. After two Israelite negotiators, Victor Ndelengisa and Edward Mpathini, failed in their pursuit of an amicable solution, deadlock ensued. Seeing no change in the government's attitude, the passive resistors, or Mgijima's fanatics, if you will, promptly assumed strategic positions facing the army. Who but the staunchest believers could face gunpowder with nothing but sticks and stones? The church says 200 of Mgijima's followers were shot and killed during the two-day siege, and more than 500 were wounded. In hindsight, what transpired in Bullhuck that fateful May set off several carbon copies of resistant massacres: Sharpeville in 1960, Soweto on June 16, 1976, Winterveld in 1985, Bahishu in 1992. And hey, weren't the 34 miners cold glocked in Marikana thought to be blind believers in some higher powers? Back in Tebalenga, Mgijima and his council were subsequently arrested and shipped to Kimberley, where they were charged with treason. He only served 3 years and came back to lead his congregation in 1924, continuing with his mixed messages of redemption, revelation, and the question of land dispossession. Although the world did not end, Mgijima remained defiant to his very last day. Instead of being rejected as a liar and a fanaticist, the gruesome mass killing served to invest him with even more emotional heft, a victim and hero who stood up to the white man and his evil ways. All right, we're closing out here, but let's keep going. Let's deal with the curses. Employment disparities remain after the end of apartheid. In fact, black South Africans saw a 31.4% unemployment rate in 2017, while among white South Africans the rate was only 6.6%. Employment is hard to come by for non-whites because of how the education system was set up during apartheid. White education focused on reading, language, and math, while non-white education mainly trained people to become unskilled laborers so that white people would not have to compete with non-white people for high-paying jobs. This plan worked exactly as it was intended to, and many non-white people are doomed to a life of working low-paying jobs simply because they were never taught the skills to advance in their careers. As of last year, white South Africans still bring in an average income that is 5 times greater than that of black South Africans. 2. Race-based displacement caused lasting inequality. Another measure taken to promote racial inequality in South Africa during apartheid was the passage of the Group Areas Act of 1950. This resulted in millions of people being forced out of their homes and sent to live in specific areas based on their race. White people were able to live in the most developed areas, while non-whites were usually placed in barren rural townships. Even if non-whites happened to live in decent areas, their neighborhoods could be demolished to make room for white residences if the land appealed to them. Because of this mass displacement, Many non-whites still live far away from developed regions, even though it is no longer mandated by law, because it is too difficult to find somewhere else to live. For instance, the Western Cape province, home to Cape Town, one of South Africa's biggest tourist destinations, is the most developed province in South Africa. The Western Cape has the lowest black population out of all the provinces at 32%. However, the Eastern Cape, South Africa's most underdeveloped province, has the highest black population at 86%. Land ownership. As of 2006, 70% of South Africa's land by area was owned by whites, despite the promises of the African National Congress to redistribute significant amounts of land across racial lines to black South Africans. All right, now, before we close out, let's read some of Deuteronomy 28. We're going to pick it up at verse 15. And hear, O Israel, and you can determine for yourself if this doesn't apply to the blacks in South Africa. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field. That means, are the Bantus and the Israelites in South Africa, the black people, are you cursed? Are you suffering in the city, and are you suffering in the rural area? That's what that means, right? Are you suffering in the township? Are you living in the slums and suffering? And are you suffering out in the bush, out where the farmlands is and all that stuff that you don't own most of the land anyway? 17. Cursed shall be thy basket and thy store. Who owns most of the businesses in South Africa? Do y'all own most of the businesses, or do the other nations own most of the businesses? Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy kind and the flocks of thy sheep. Cursed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shalt thou be when thou goest out. All right, we're at verse 20. Let's see. I'm going to skip down some. We're going to skip down. Pick it up at 25. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. And thy carcass shall be meat unto all fowls of the air, and unto the beasts of the earth, and no man shall fray them away. The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt, and with the hemorrhoids, and with the scab, and with the itch, wherefore thou canst be healed. The Lord shall smite thee with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart. So this part in 27, with the botch of Egypt, and with hemorrhoids, and with the scab, this is talking about disease, right? In South Africa, who has the highest rates of disease? Is it the white South Africans, or is it the Bantu South Africans? All right. Thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build a house, and thou shalt not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant the vineyard, and shalt not gather the grapes thereof. Did y'all not do the work on the land, and then the settlers came and took the land? Did y'all not help build South Africa doing the hard labor, but you don't get to benefit from none of that hard labor economically, right? Didn't some of y'all have wives that were taken by the Afrikaners? All right. Now, thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. Earlier in the lesson, we read about slavery in South Africa, right? And the slave trade dealing with South Africa. All right, let's skip down. And thou shalt become, we're going to skip down to 37. And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations whither the Lord shall lead thee. A byword is like, you want to know what a byword is? Kafir. You know how they say kafir about you? Just like here in America, they have the N word, right? All right. Thou shalt be, 41. Thou shalt begat sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. All right. All thy trees and fruit of thy land shall the locust consume. The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. The stranger means other nations, right? Other people. So in South Africa, isn't the white man higher up than you? Isn't the Indian and the Asian in South Africa higher up than you? Isn't even the colored person and the Cape Malays, aren't they doing economically better than the black South Africans, right? The natives to the land. So the stranger will rise up above you, right? He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. Who owns most of the banks and the wealth, right, in South Africa? Do you or do the strangers and the people from the other nations or the white South Africans? All right. Now, and I'm just going to stop there because it's been a long lesson. Y'all can read the rest of Deuteronomy 28 on your own time. I just want to touch on some points. So we're going to close out. I hope you enjoyed this history lesson. The next slide is just going to be the sources, and I'll leave that up for a minute so that if y'all want to jot down the sources. But shalom, and hope you enjoyed the lesson.